They thought they understood power. They had seen it in the thunder of tanks, in the shadow of Messerschmitts, in the fire that rolled across Europe. But when they were captured, when they crossed the ocean in silence and chains, they saw something far greater, not the power of guns, but the power of machines built by free men. For the German prisoners of war shipped to America in 1944, defeat didn't come with bullets, came with understanding. They had been told that America was weak, a land of luxury, untested in real struggle, that its soldiers were soft, its people spoiled, its factories fragile, that the master race would outbuild and outfight anyone. But from the moment they set foot on American soil, everything they believed about the enemy began to collapse. Because here, behind the fences of the POW camps, they saw a world that ran on energy, precision, and cooperation unlike anything in Nazi Germany. They had come to fight an enemy. Instead, they found a civilization that worked like a living engine. The first wave of German prisoners arrived in New York under heavy guard, silent, thin, defiant. They were taken by train across a country they'd only seen in propaganda posters. Through the glass, they saw something strange. Factories, hundreds of them, belching smoke, roaring with energy, not for war, but for production. Coal trains stretched for miles. Rows of tractors plowed fields that looked endless. Cities buzzed like hives, each worker a piece of something larger, something alive. Many prisoners later wrote that it was during this journey, before they even reached their camps, that they realized Germany could never match this scale. The Reich had industry. America had momentum. Their new world was surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by men in olive drab. But inside those fences, something unexpected waited for them. Work, structure, and a strange kind of respect. American guards were strict, yes, but they weren't cruel. They didn't shout racial slogans, didn't beat or humiliate prisoners. They treated them as men, not monsters. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, one of the largest POW camps in America, the Germans found workshops equipped with tools, books, even chalkboards. They were encouraged to build, to fix, to learn. When one German asked his American overseer why they were being trusted with tools, the guard laughed and said, "You're prisoners, not animals. We'd rather have you build something than rot." For men who had lived under Nazi discipline, where every mistake meant punishment, every order was law, this casual humanity was confusing, and yet it changed them. A few months later, many of these POWs were sent to work, under Geneva rules, in factories, farms, and mills across the American heartland. That's where the real shock began. They saw workers, ordinary Americans, operating machines with incredible precision. They saw women welding tank hulls, assembling aircraft engines, driving trucks. They saw foremen listening to suggestions from their workers, something unthinkable in German industry. And the sheer scale was overwhelming. In one Michigan plant, a single assembly line produced more Jeeps in a week than an entire German factory could in a month. The prisoners whispered among themselves, "How can you fight a nation that builds faster than you can destroy?" They realized that America wasn't winning the war because of luck or numbers. It was winning because every citizen was part of the fight. From mechanics to mothers, from engineers to farmers, every hand turned the same wheel. In the quiet of their bunks at night, the German POWs would talk about what they'd seen that day. One of them, Hans Meller, wrote later in his diary, "In Germany we worked for fear. In America they work for pride. That is the difference between obedience and freedom." He described visiting an American factory that made Liberty engines, massive aircraft power plants that looked like metal monsters. The plant ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, no interruption. Workers joked with their bosses, played music on the radio, and still every part that left the line fit perfectly. In Germany, precision came from discipline. In America, it came from dedication. And that, more than any bomb or bullet, is what broke the illusion of German superiority. The guards began to notice it too. The prisoners were no longer defiant, no longer angry. They began to ask questions about machines, about systems, about ideas. In some camps, American officers even arranged lectures for them. Lessons in democracy, economics, and technology. A former POW later recalled, "We learned more from the Americans in 1 year of captivity than we did in 10 years under Hitler." When news of Germany's surrender reached the camps in 1945, many of the prisoners didn't cheer or cry. They just sat in silence because deep down, they already knew the war had been lost long before the first bomb fell on Berlin. It was lost the moment they stepped into an American factory and realized they were facing not an army of soldiers, but an army of workers. Months later, when the war finally ended and ships began carrying the prisoners back home, they looked once more at the country that had held them captive. From the decks they saw ports filled with cranes, trains, and shipyards, each one alive with sound and purpose. They didn't see ruins. They saw power built from peace. And as the coastline faded, many of them carried a strange kind of gratitude. They had come to America as soldiers of a dying empire. They left as witnesses to a living idea, that freedom itself could be an engine stronger than any steel machine. When the war finally reached its climax in Europe, thousands of German POWs were already scattered across the United States, living, working, and quietly observing the greatest industrial power on Earth. But for many, the real shock wasn't just in the machines they saw, it was in the people who ran them. The men and women of America's wartime workforce didn't wear uniforms, but they fought their own kind of battle. One fought not with rifles, but with wrenches, blueprints, and belief. And to the Germans, that was something entirely new. They came from a nation where every decision flowed downward, where fear, not freedom, drove production. But in the United States, even the smallest worker seemed to have a voice. If something didn't work on the line, a welder could stop the whole process, make a suggestion, and actually be heard. That was unthinkable in the Reich. In Germany, a worker who questioned authority might end up in prison. Here, that same question could make a factory more efficient and make a soldier's life easier thousands of miles away. This culture of cooperation fascinated the prisoners. They began to realize that American strength didn't just come from industry, it came from unity, a kind of invisible teamwork that stretched from coast to coast. One POW, Carl Schaefer, who had worked as a mechanic before the war, was assigned to a Kansas farm to repair broken tractors. He remembered seeing crates of spare parts labeled, "Made in Ohio," shipped from Detroit, tested in California. Each part fit perfectly, as if millions of hands across thousands of miles were all moving in rhythm. In Germany, such coordination required endless orders and punishments. In America, it just seemed to happen. Carl later wrote, "Their strength is not just in machines. It's in how easily they work together. In Germany, we had better discipline. In America, they have better harmony." By 1945, the POWs had become an invisible workforce that touched nearly every part of American life. They harvested wheat in Texas, repaired roads in Louisiana, built barns in Nebraska, and even helped rebuild factories. They were treated fairly, paid small wages, and given food that many hadn't tasted in years. But the most powerful lessons came not from what they did, but from what they saw. In one camp near Huntsville, Texas, the prisoners were tasked with building wooden crates for aircraft engines. Each morning, trucks loaded with engines would arrive, and each evening they'd leave for ports to be shipped overseas. One day, a POW named Dieter asked an American supervisor, "How many of these engines do you send each week?" The man just grinned and said, "Too many to count, son. We build them faster than the enemy can shoot them down." Dieter laughed. But he didn't forget those words, because behind that casual joke was a truth that haunted him. Germany was burning through its last reserves, while America was still just warming up. Inside the camps, the Germans formed small study groups. They talked about what they'd seen, the factories, the systems, the scale. Many began sketching ideas for their own industries back home, hoping one day they could rebuild Germany not through conquest, but through cooperation like the Americans. One former Luftwaffe pilot, Werner, wrote after the war, "We used to believe the future belonged to those who conquered. Now we understood the future belongs to those who create." Even the simplest things shocked them. They were amazed at how much food was wasted in America. Not out of greed, but abundance. In some camps, uneaten bread was thrown away daily, a sight unimaginable in wartime Germany, where starvation had become normal. They saw farmers plowing with massive tractors while their own families back home struggled to find horses. They saw teenage boys driving trucks, women working in steel plants, and elderly men volunteering to collect scrap metal for the war effort. Everywhere they looked, the same idea repeated. Everyone contributed. As 1945 approached, the tone inside the camps changed. The early arrogance and resentment were gone. The prisoners no longer argued about Hitler's secret weapons or inevitable victory. Those words sounded hollow now. Instead, they asked about blueprints, machine tolerances, fuel efficiency, electricity grids. They wanted to know how the United States managed to feed, arm, and transport millions of soldiers while still expanding its economy. They didn't understand how a democracy could fight with such focus, until they realized it was because it was a democracy. Freedom didn't make America weak. It made it unstoppable. One day, a group of POWs was transported through a major industrial hub, Detroit. Through the train windows, they saw something unforgettable. Endless lines of factories stretching beyond the horizon. Smoke rising in every direction. Convoys of brand-new tanks rumbling toward the rail lines. Hundreds of B-24 Liberators parked at an airfield like gleaming metal giants waiting for flight. And above all that noise, a single billboard read, "The Arsenal of Democracy, built by free men." For the German prisoners, it was like a revelation. That one phrase explained everything they'd been trying to understand. The Reich had enslaved its people for victory. America had freed its people and found victory as a result. By the end of the war, many POWs had quietly abandoned their loyalty to Hitler's cause. Some even wrote letters to their families urging them to surrender, warning that continuing the fight was madness. And though those letters were censored, the change inside the camps was undeniable. They no longer looked at America with hatred, but with awe. They had seen the real reason Germany had lost. Not just military defeat, but a failure of imagination. Because they had fought for a world built on fear, and been defeated by one built on freedom. And for many, that realization would follow them for the rest of their lives. Long after the war ended, long after the fences came down, long after they stepped back onto German soil, they would return not as soldiers, but as witnesses to a truth their nation had never told them, that a society powered by free minds will always outbuild one ruled by fear. When the war ended, the barbed wire around America's POW camps didn't just hold prisoners. It held thousands of men who were no longer the same. They had entered those fences as soldiers of the Reich, proud and certain of Germany's superiority. But as the months passed, as they labored in factories, fields, and rail yards, a quiet realization began to grow. The German prisoners of war had seen America's true weapon, and it wasn't a bomb, a plane, or a tank. It was organization powered by freedom. Many of them remembered the early days of the war. The blazing victories across Europe, the flags, the songs, the arrogance of a nation convinced that discipline alone could conquer the world. But now, in the stillness of their captivity, they began comparing that world to the one they saw every day around them. They noticed that the Americans didn't seem afraid of authority. Factory managers joked with workers. Soldiers laughed with officers. Truck drivers talked to engineers as equals. No one was trembling in fear of their superiors, yet everything worked. Back in Germany, discipline had been everything. Orders shouted, punishments given, obedience demanded. And yet, for all that fear, the system had collapsed. In America, there was laughter, improvisation, even chaos sometimes, but the production never stopped. One POW, named Hans Becker, who had worked in a German munitions plant before being captured in Tunisia, was assigned to a U.S. factory making aircraft engines. He was stunned to see that nearly every foreman was taking suggestions from ordinary workers, women, even teenagers, and implementing them within hours. In Germany, a single design change required layers of permission, a dozen signatures, and weeks of paperwork. Here, in America, it took a conversation during lunch break. One day, Hans saw a young woman tighten a bolt differently and reduce the time it took to assemble the entire engine. When the supervisor asked how she figured it out, she just shrugged. Didn't like the old way. Thought this might work faster. The supervisor laughed, tested it, and then told everyone to do it her way. That moment changed Hans forever. He later said, "In Germany, we worked harder. In America, they worked smarter. And the difference won the war." By the summer of 1945, most of the POWs were granted greater freedom inside their camps. Some even went on supervised trips to nearby towns. They saw movie theaters, restaurants, and stores overflowing with goods, all while Germany lay in ruins. They couldn't comprehend how a nation at war on two fronts could still live so comfortably. When they asked an American guard how it was possible, he simply said, "We don't have a Führer telling us how to think. Everyone just does their part." That simple statement struck the prisoners like thunder. In the Reich, everything had been about obedience to one man's vision. In America, everything was about contribution to a shared one. As the months went on, U.S. officials even organized educational programs inside the camps, classes in history, economics, and democracy. At first, the prisoners laughed. They thought it was propaganda. But then they started listening. They learned how the U.S. government wasn't built around fear of collapse, but around checks and balances. They learned that a free press criticized its leaders openly, and yet the nation didn't crumble. They saw that the Constitution wasn't a weapon, but a framework that made growth unstoppable. In those classrooms, the men who had once worshipped the Nazi war machine began to question everything they had believed. Some POWs were sent to work on massive reconstruction projects, building bridges, repairing roads, or helping clean up rail yards. And each time they saw an American train rumble past, pulling hundreds of freight cars filled with weapons, food, and fuel, the same thought repeated. This is why we lost. It wasn't just America's factories. It wasn't even its resources. It was the will behind them, a will that could not be ordered or beaten into existence, a will born from freedom. One day in late 1945, a German officer named Otto Meyer, captured in North Africa, was working at a shipyard in Louisiana. He stood watching as a group of welders built the hull of a massive transport vessel. Sparks flew, hammers rang, and laughter echoed across the docks. An American foreman walked by, chewing on a cigar, and asked, "You boys ever build ships like this back home?" Otto smiled bitterly. "We built them, but not like this. In Germany, we built them with fear. Here, you build them with joy." The foreman chuckled. "That's the secret, friend. Fear breaks things. Joy beaujizing." Otto never forgot those words. As 1946 arrived and the first groups of POWs were sent back to Europe, many were conflicted. They wanted to go home, but they also feared what home had become. The Germany they'd known was gone. Cities were rubble. Families were starving. And the Nazi ideology that once filled them with pride now filled them with shame. But America had given them something else, a glimpse of what could be rebuilt. They carried notebooks filled with sketches of factories, notes about production methods, and ideas about how to organize workers differently. Some had even copied ideas about labor unions, cooperative management, and local governance. They were still soldiers, but now they were soldiers of a new idea. One POW, Erich Muller, wrote in his diary before leaving, "We entered their country as enemies. We leave as witnesses. What we have seen here will shape the Germany that comes next." And for many, it did. After returning home, hundreds of former POWs would later become engineers, teachers, and community leaders in post-war West Germany, quietly spreading the lessons they had learned in the camps of Texas, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania. They had seen what made America powerful, and they wanted to build a Germany that could stand beside that power, not against it. Because in the end, those men realized something that no weapon could teach them. America didn't win because it was stronger. It won because it was freer. And for the German prisoners who witnessed that truth firsthand, that understanding, that awakening, became the most powerful victory of all. By 1946, The world's largest war had ended. But for the German prisoners scattered across America, the war inside their minds had just begun. They had entered the camps believing they were serving the most advanced, disciplined nation on earth. They left realizing they had been part of something hollow, a system built on obedience instead of innovation, fear instead of cooperation. And as the trains began to roll, carrying the POWs east toward their ruined homeland, they carried something else unseen, an idea. Not a political one, not even a patriotic one, but an understanding that power wasn't built by tyranny, it was built by trust. When the first POWs disembarked from the U.S. ships into the shattered ports of Bremerhaven and Hamburg, they were met with silence. No cheating crowds, no vans. Just dust, hunger, and the ghosts of cities that had once symbolized German might. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Rail yards were twisted steel. The factories that once produced the weapons of the Reich were flattened or dismantled by the Allies. But for men who had seen Detroit's assembly lines, Pittsburgh's furnaces, and California's shipyards, this devastation looked less like an ending and more like a blueprint. They knew what was possible. They had seen it with their own eyes. Some of them, like Hans Becker and Otto Meyer, who had worked in American plants, found work in the ruins of German industry. They rebuilt small workshops from scrap metal, applied American-style teamwork, and slowly started producing again. Instead of waiting for orders from above, they formed production circles, small groups where workers discussed how to improve efficiency together. They removed the old military hierarchy from the shop floor. For the first time, mechanics, welders, and engineers worked side by side. Not out of fear, but pride. It was a quiet revolution born not in Berlin, but in the farmlands and factories of the American Midwest. By 1947, as West Germany began to take shape under Allied supervision, former POWs became unlikely messengers of democracy. They told stories of how American workers could question authority without punishment. They described schools that taught not obedience, but curiosity. And they shared the belief that a nation's real power wasn't in its weapons. It was in its people. These men, once loyal to Hitler, now preached the value of free thought and open dialogue. In one small Bavarian village, a former prisoner named Carl Fischer organized community meetings patterned after the camp discussions in Texas. The villagers debated how to rebuild their town hall, how to reopen schools, how to manage food rations fairly. It wasn't just reconstruction, it was rebirth. For Carl, the lessons of the POW camp were simple. The Americans didn't just show us factories. They showed us what a free mind can build. Across the Atlantic, American guards and officers who had overseen the POW camps began receiving letters, written in shaky German, often with broken English, thanking them. The letters came from men who were now carpenters, teachers, engineers, and mayors. One letter from 1948 read, "You taught us more than we understood at the time. We thought we were defeated, but in your camps we discovered how to win." Another said simply, "Freedom is the greatest machine America ever built." These letters, tucked away in archives, became quiet reminders that the victory of 1945 wasn't just military. It was moral. As West Germany rose from the ashes through the Marshall Plan, the lessons of those POWs took root in its foundations. They encouraged efficiency without fear, leadership through respect, and innovation through discussion. Many of them joined the new industries that would define post-war Europe: automotive, electrical, and chemical engineering. And wherever they went, they carried with them that same American spirit of experimentation. Factories that once echoed with shouted orders now hummed with conversation. Designers were encouraged to try new methods. Workers were rewarded for ideas that improved production. In this way, the ghost of America's wartime factories lived on, not as an empire of machines, but as a philosophy. Even decades later, some historians noted how unusual West Germany's recovery was. How could a nation so thoroughly destroyed rise so quickly? The answer, they found, lay partly in the minds of those who had once been prisoners. They had absorbed more than just industrial techniques, they had absorbed a worldview. And while East Germany fell under the heavy hand of Soviet control, rigid, fearful, and slow, the West became something different: agile, curious, and free. The contrast was unmistakable. It was as if the POW camps had been seeds, scattered across the new Germany, each one sprouting into a small piece of democracy. By the 1960s, many of those men had grandchildren who grew up in peace, prosperity, and freedom. They worked in modern factories, drove cars made by companies rebuilt from the ashes, and studied in universities that encouraged questions, not obedience. Few of them ever knew that their grandfathers had learned those values behind barbed wire in a foreign land. But if you ask those old men, sitting quietly in German cafes or standing beside rebuilt cathedrals, they would tell you something that still gave them goosebumps. "We saw the future once," they'd say. "It was wearing overalls, holding a wrench, and laughing while it worked." And that is the final echo of this story, not of defeat, but of transformation. Because the German POWs who witnessed America's industrial might didn't just see machines. They saw a civilization powered by freedom, where every citizen was a part of the engine. And long after the smoke of war faded, that idea, that freedom builds faster than fear ever can, became the most enduring lesson of all.